So let's move a conversation now and talk about the Al-Shabaab terror group. So there's a new report that has been released by the UN, and it has not yet been made public, but the New York Times has published a story about it because they have seen the report. And it's about how the Al-Shabaab has been able to exploit the Somali banking system and even invest in real estate. What they've done is they've been able to really move in some good cash because of how they collect the money. They charge levies from business people, for businesses. They're the ones that charge levies for business and other ways of generating revenue. According to this report, just between December 2019 and August this year, they had raised $13 million in revenue. Now, there are very many embargoes and sanctions imposed on the Al-Shabaab terror group, which is linked to Al-Qaeda by the UN Security Council, that would then see the terror group not being able to either move the cash out of the country, move the cash around through the regulated financial system. But apparently they have found ways of doing this. And through the banking system, just looking at the bank accounts that are linked to Al-Shabaab, and they are able to bring in money through various organizations, about $3 million in the banking system through the Al-Shabaab. So they have cash, they're able to exploit this, they're able to run their operations, they're able then to even go around the sanctions that have been placed by the international bodies. What does this mean? What does it say?
It's very clear they're acting, and they probably are, an entity unto their own, answering to nobody, under no authority whatsoever, doing whatever it is that they please, with sanctions or no sanctions. They're operating. They've not been shut down, not been taken out, and everybody's well aware in the manner in which they operate. And this UN report that says that they continue to do this is not news. It just happens to be that they've been able to collate this information and are putting it out there for public consumption. But the fact that they are clearly a well-financed, well-organized group in terms of how they operate, that's been very clear for a long time.
Yeah.
And it is also clear now that these funds that they collect are not just for any kind of terrorist activities. They are putting this money into sectors that would be seen to be quite lucrative. Real estate has come out as a result of this.
By the time a group of individuals get to even levy tax, you have to ask, what is this service that they provide, or what is viewed as a service that they provide that makes it possible for people to feel that it is in their interest to actually pay these these taxes?
Yeah.
In some, maybe it could be people thinking it's in their interest. Maybe they're providing a service. In others, it's force. You are basically blackmailed, and you're told, you're pushed in a corner. So when they operate, for example, within a port, and they say every import, you must pay a certain levy.
All right.
Or going around and saying, so there's this particular arm that a Muslim is supposed to give in a year, and they say, this is where you give it to.
Somalia has a government, does
it
not?
Yep.
Okay. Now, this argument bears weight because we assume the government is also doing the same, or the so-called elected government. So then you could argue that when you have a group of people functioning or have the same functions as any government in the world would have, that they themselves are a government.
Yep.
And even as we say that they force people, it appears to me that if they've existed for as long as they have, they must have people who support them, and they must have followers.
True. Let's bring in somebody who understands the issues of Somalia and the entire Horn of Africa. This is Rashid Abdi, who's joining us on the line. Good morning, Rashid.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's good to have you on the show, and welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you very much.
Now, Rashid, looking at this report by the New York Times and understanding what's been happening with the Al-Shabaab over the very many years, does this story or the report from the UN make any sense to you? Does it sound believable from somebody who understands the region?
I think the report will only come as a surprise to people who haven't followed Somalia even from afar. But everyone knows that Al-Shabaab has become a much more entrenched insurgency, although the territory which it controls is now much more diminished because of action by Amisom troops, which include Kenyan troops. Still, Al-Shabaab, I think, has become a much more resilient rural insurgency. But apart from that, I think we have seen also how Al-Shabaab has begun to grow as a welfare state, where they collect taxes or zakat and then distribute it among the poor. We also know that Al-Shabaab's courts have become very effective in really dispensing very swift justice for land disputes, for marital disputes. So people rely on it because largely the state is absent. And I think, as one of your panelists just minutes ago said, Al-Shabaab basically is exploiting the absence of state and has become actually a state, a shadow state of its own. And this state now, collects taxes, dispenses justice, conducts law and order, operations in southern Somalia. So we are now talking essentially of a state within a state.
And Abdi, is this, even as we look at this, is it accepted or is it feared that Somalis will pay this tax because they realize that this is what is here to stay in the absence of government, or because they have been coerced to do so?
Yeah, I think there are two ways of looking at it. Al-Shabaab uses, I think, a variety of ways for basically making itself legitimate or credible in the eyes of the public. So they definitely offer some services which include law and order. And so for that reason, probably people will not feel compelled to give Al-Shabaab taxes. Then there is also, I think, definitely a criminal and predatory element to Al-Shabaab's taxation. And we see that in especially in rural areas where they go to farmers and then tell them, we need you to pay us this amount of money. And then we also see also a similar pattern where they also extort money from business people. So there is a predatory criminal element to this, which we should not lose sight of. But I think to say Al-Shabaab's tax regime is completely predatory, I think also is wrong. There are people who are willingly giving Al-Shabaab money because they feel that Al-Shabaab offers them protection, gives them justice, and so on and so forth. So that is how I'll characterize it. It's a mix of persuasion, but also includes predation as well.
What you've described, is it the reality that has metamorphosized with time, or is this the way Al-Shabaab was always seen by the people of Somalia?
Yeah. I think Al-Shabaab, the way to look at Al-Shabaab is that it has evolved over time. Remember, it started as a small insurgency which was fighting the Ethiopians. Then progressively, it actually became an insurgency that controls territory. So they became administrators, and so that exerted, I think, pressure on the movement. They had to be seen to be, responding to people's need for security, people's need for, a judicial system, people's need for some form of basic services. And this is why I think Al-Shabaab has proven itself to be a much more responsive entity in South Central Somalia than the state. And that is where it derives its legitimacy, and that is where it derives the support it has from the public. The fact that Al-Shabaab officers are more cleaner, less corrupt than the state, also I think has created this huge support which they have in South Central Somalia. So I think it is an evolution. The more Al-Shabaab has been, the more government has become weaker, more corrupt, more dysfunctional, the more Al-Shabaab has grown in strength. And we see this dynamic, I think, in many contexts, especially Afghanistan.
Why has the government become what you've just described?
This is I think, partly to do with the fact that you have an internationally led process where I think a lot of money is coming in. You have people who are not committed to the government, who have families abroad, who basically are there to get as much money as they want in a very short period of time and then go back. So I think you have a very dysfunctional state, very weak institutions, and also a lot of money coming in, largely for state building, peace building. And that, I think, has created a very corrupt environment in which Somalia is listed as among the most corrupt countries in the world. It has always been number one in the last 10 years. And that clearly tells you a lot. It tells you why Al-Shabaab is growing in strength. It's because people are completely fed up with, I think, a very dysfunctional state, which always hasn't gone far in achieving all the goals which it set for itself.
So in a sense, we could actually say that the government's failure is what has probably largely contributed to Al-Shabaab's success.
Absolutely. That is, I couldn't have put it better.
Okay. Now let me ask a different question. There's Al-Shabaab is what we know the organization as, but the full name is Haraka Al-Shabaab Mujahideen. What on earth does that mean?
That means the movement. Haraka in Arabic is movement. Mujahideen is those who struggle on the path of jihad. So this is the jihad movement. That is how they call themselves.
Why I ask for that definition is because when you describe what Al-Shabaab is doing and then you describe the government in Somalia, you are more or less describing almost every government on this continent and in certain parts of the world, because people are taxed, but the one thing that people do not see is what their tax money is doing. That is a constant and consistent complaint. The fundamental difference is that Al-Shabaab seems to be providing what you call an opposition government. The only difference is that they are armed, and that they are not afraid to confront people with, should we say, with a little warfare. Now, you've said that they are losing territory because of the troops that are the Amisom troops. What do you think would happen if the Amisom troops withdrew?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There's no doubt that the moment the African troops leave Somalia, it wouldn't take Al-Shabaab hours to basically take control of Somalia, entire Somalia. And that is the sad reality, that the only bulwark against Al-Shabaab taking over the state, or the only barrier, is actually the Amisom troops. And this is the reality, and I can't see how in the short to medium term Amisom would leave Somalia. There is a process now underway. They are talking about an exit strategy, but I think we are a long way away from Amisom exiting Somalia, largely because Al-Shabaab is still very strong. Despite the fact that it has been squeezed and moved out of many towns and villages, I think it still retains very active combatants. It has also, by the way, survived a very relentless campaign of drone strikes by the United States. But still, it retains military capability. And the day Amisom leaves, basically they will roll in back into the towns and villages and take control.
It would seem that they still are, even with Amisom's presence in Somali, that they still do have the control, whether it wants to be seen on the surface or even deeper. It seems that the control is there, and that whatever piece or outside control is just temporary and makeshift in some way. What is the intent of government? Really, what is the mandate of government for the country? Because it would seem, looking from the outside looking in, that it's just puppetry of sorts to say that there is a government without the practice of government in the country, especially when we look at the face of Al-Shabaab. What really is the purpose at this point?
That is a good point, and I think the history of the Somali government in the last 20 years has been extremely disappointing. We had a long period of transition. Now we have a permanent government of sorts, but in reality, it is a transition within a transition. Many of the tasks which were set for the government to become functional have not been achieved. Just weeks ago, there was a serious electoral crisis in which the whole electoral system basically broke down. And so it's a government which has been latching from one crisis to another. And I think this dysfunction, this deep malaise within the state structures and institutions is what has given, it's the oxygen which gives Al-Shabaab basically, allows Al-Shabaab to survive and also to thrive.
As I hear this, Rashid, I'm sensing some sense of contradiction in a way, in terms of the progress that has been made, whether it's positive progress or whether it's negative progress. Just looking back at what you've just described as the move to have some semblance of government in place. We've come from a system where there was no government. It was just warlords running the country, into the Islamic Courts Union, into the transition of federal government, into now this government with wide international support. And we have also seen the emergence of these militias, like now the Al-Shabaab, and the serious pushback that it has received from internationally backed armies. There is the Amisom troops, there is the support that they get from the drone strikes with the US government, and you even said that it has been losing ground. So how is it then that we have, on the one hand, some semblance of government coming and taking control of the country, and Al-Shabaab losing ground, but at the same time, Al-Shabaab appearing to be gaining some clout in the country? How is that possible with those two?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a good question. I would probably answer it in this way. First of all, the government physical control is very minimal. It doesn't control any city beyond Mogadishu. The other federal states also control, with the exception probably of Puntland, every federal state also has that same problem where they don't control beyond the cities. They do not control the rural countries, the countryside. So if you look, because Somalia is a huge country, if you look at the map, probably you would say something like 40 to 50% of the country is still in Al-Shabaab hands. And so just looking at that reality is significant, because it means the government cannot extend itself, cannot extend its reach beyond these major cities. And so Al-Shabaab is able to basically put down roots in some of these rural places. It basically has a captive community and population, but then also it feeds off the weakness of the state. This is a state which is extremely weak and thoroughly corrupt. And so let me just give you an example. Land disputes are very frequent in Mogadishu. So people constantly fight over land, and I think Kenyans recognize that reality. So people fight over land, and land disputes, land cases have become very, very problematic. Now, the government's judicial system is extremely weak, is unable to cope with this demand for justice over land. So what some people do is basically just walk something like 20 to 30 kilometers out of the city and go to the jungle and meet Al-Shabaab's, justice or basically lawyers and sheikhs, and tell them that this is the land crisis we have. And so many litigants are actually happy to take their cases to Al-Shabaab to get a quick and swift resolution. And remember, when Al-Shabaab court basically passes a verdict, that verdict will be enforced even by blood. So when Al-Shabaab court basically says that, Eric, you have to deliver, you have to give back the land because it doesn't belong to you, Eric will definitely give back that land, because if he fails, Eric gets killed. And so that swift but brutal justice is extremely effective, and many people actually find it easy to deal with Al-Shabaab and the state. And so I think that in a nutshell, it is the state's weakness and inability to actually respond to some of these very acute needs of society that makes Al-Shabaab relevant.
On the line with us this morning is Rashid Abdi. He is a Horn of Africa analyst, helping us to unravel a new report by the United Nations that says that Al-Shabaab is exploiting Somali banking and investing in real estate. It's making a lot of money. Just between December and August this year, Al-Shabaab was able to raise revenues of up to $13 million US. About 3 million of that has entered the financial system. This is despite international sanctions imposed by the UN. And you're trying to understand what is it that Al-Shabaab then is able to do in that country? What is the role of the government, the internationally supported government, in fighting Al-Shabaab? As we take this break, we'll come back and continue with this conversation. Broadcasting from Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, Eldoret, Nyeri, Malindi, online on www.spicefm.co.ke, on Spice FM KE, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, as well as KTN Home for the next 1.5 hours as well. In the room this and every morning is CT Muga, Nduoko, Eric Latif, and joining us on the line is a Horn of Africa analyst, Rashid Abdi. We are unpacking the story by the New York Times from a report by the United Nations about Al-Shabaab and how it's been able to exploit Somali banking and system and investing in real estate. Rashid, from looking at this report, now the report they say is still embargoed, but the New York Times has been able to see it on all. And trying to understand exactly how then they have been able to get into the financial system and move the money around. What is it that they have done, and who could we say is helping them to achieve this?
Yeah. I think one has to remember that the Somali banking system and the financial system basically collapsed like the rest of Somalia in 1991. And I think for the last 20 years, the country has been reliant on a very makeshift kind of system to survive. So there isn't we are only beginning to see the emergence of indigenous banks and institutions right now. But also there are, after 9/11, there was a big crackdown on Somali financial institutions, largely based on perception that the Hawala system, or the informal money transfer system, was involved in basically facilitating terrorism. So that also, I think, created a huge disincentive for the creation of a banking system. So Somalia does not have a formal banking system. A few banks have begun to emerge in recent years, in the last especially 5 years. They are very rudimentary, but the bulk of money is still with the Hawala system. This is the system where in which people rely on for receiving and sending money. But also, interestingly, there is something similar now to M-Pesa in Somalia, which is called MZAD. So these are very rudimentary structures still. You can't compare it to a very sophisticated economic system like that of Kenya. But still, I think Al-Shabaab exploits, first of all, this weak system, this lack of regulation, in order to be able to then move some of this cash around. And I think what Al-Shabaab is interested in is basically to launder this money, to basically put this money in real estate in particular. And this is what I think the report is clearly highlighting, that despite the very weak structures and the lack of regulation, Al-Shabaab is able to find loopholes and also exploit these loopholes in order to then funnel this money through the system and then be able to launder this cash. And this is, I think, it shouldn't come as a surprise, because this is something which is a pattern which is repeated in many of these fragile or conflict societies, where powerful conflict actors find ways to manipulate or find ways of bypassing the system, and then basically making. This is about the conflict economy, in other words.
Sure, Abdi, the conflict economy, and it's interesting that you mentioned conflict actors, because if Al-Shabaab has taken advantage of an already depressed state, an already depressed economy, as it were, are there actors who are benefiting from Somali being in the state in which it is? Because we've seen examples around the world where economies have been depressed because of conflict, and we have seen the salvation of these economies by other actors. Not so much in Somalia since 1991, like you've said. There hasn't really been any kind of direct intervention to kind of lift Somalia out of this economic hell that it's in, really. It has just been introduction of Amisom troops here, introduction of the UN, introduction of other countries sending in their troops to kind of hold a makeshift peace. But in terms of really digging the country out of this problem, there hasn't really been that intervention. Now, Al-Shabaab has taken advantage of this, but are there external players who are benefiting directly from Somalia remaining in the situation in which it is in?
Yeah. I think you touched on a point which has exercised a lot of minds in recent years. Somalia occupies a very geostrategic location. It overlooks the Gulf of Aden. It is close to the Red Sea. These are waterways which are quite vital for international commerce. This is, where probably close to 40-45% of world's energy supplies pass through. Throughout the Cold War, but even in the age of empire, imperial powers used to compete for foothold or for access or dominance over this. So it is one of the most strategic regions. The Horn of Africa is the most strategic region, one of the most strategic regions in the world. So it isn't a surprise that many powers would want to influence Somalia, would want to have a stake in Somalia. And we have seen the emergence of what we call middle powers, countries like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. All of them are now competing for a stake, competing for basically influence in Somalia. And all these actors are not rowing in the same direction. They are not working together to lift Somalia from out of conflict, out of fragility, and to help Somalia. They are pulling Somalia in different directions. And I think their rivalry and this bitter Gulf crisis, which has spilled over into Somalia, has had a terrible effect on the country. It has driven a wedge between Mogadishu and also the federal states. It has, I think, aggravated the relations between Somaliland, which has claimed, independence against, and Somalia. So I think the international regional competition for Somalia has had a devastating impact on that country. And I would argue that part of the crisis which we face in Somalia today is because many powers, outside powers, are competing over this war-shattered country. And I think any analysis of Somalia would be inadequate unless it factors in this geopolitical contestation for Somalia.
This competition you speak of, what form does it take?
It takes, classically, it takes the form of basically grooming of politicians. We have seen that in every electoral cycle. One of the Gulf actors, basically sends money and then grooms certain politicians. And the Qataris in particular are very adept at this game. For example, in the last 2 electoral cycles, the Qatari government has been directly involved in basically picking and enabling certain politicians to actually win. Farmajo will not have won if it wasn't for Qatari funding, for example.
Now, if you look at what you're saying, because one, you have the UN forces, now you have the Middle East players, and we've thrown in Turkey into it, also wanting a slice of this particular food commodity. But for these people to actually have a foothold, it means that those who were there militarily do not seem to have an objection to what they're doing. Would I be correct in saying so?
Yes, and I think we tend to analyze the negative impacts of geopolitical competition by simply looking at the impact it has on fragile countries like Somalia. But remember, these fragile countries are also led by predatory elites who do not have the interest of their people at heart. So what they do essentially is that they counter-manipulate these actors. So in other words, this is a clever elite that plays one power against another. And this is a pattern you see repeated in many conflict settings where the elites have their own interest beyond the countries where they are rulers.
I mentioned earlier on, or rather I asked, what you thought might happen if the UN forces withdrew.
AU.
Now, AU? No, AU, UN,
Amisom.
Amisom, yes, UN. Is the same kettle of fish. Given the evidence that we have about the unimpressive success rate of such interventions, what do you think is likely to happen if Amisom and all these bodies that are supported by the UN and the West continue staying in Somalia? Do you foresee a situation where Somalia would actually get out of this morass that it's in and actually become a proud nation that is able to stand on its own?
That's an excellent question. I have no doubt in my mind that the future of Somalia in the longer term would probably be better than what it is now. In the short to medium term, this country will still be in crisis and turmoil. But the roadmap ahead, I think, will have to include a disengagement, a gradual disengagement of the international community from these peace processes. I think Somalia has probably reached a point where unless it takes the lead in its own,
future,
it becomes, it takes over its own processes of state building and institution building. If everything is internationally led, regionally led, I think that's a very unhealthy dynamic. It makes these people completely dependent, and I think it has to be done, in a calibrated way. I think a sudden international pullout from Somalia will be catastrophic, will lead to a collapse, and will allow Al-Shabab to take over. So what we need is a kind of a planned exit or withdrawal where Somalia's, for example, military forces will be trained up to a point where they can be able to take charge of from Amisom. Then institutions built and with that become functional. So I think there's no doubt that the heavy international engagement in Somalia is counterproductive in the longer term. And you need to build the independence and resilience of these people. And if you want to do that, you cannot be there permanently. So
Right.
I think you are right, Professor, that you need to disengage, but you need to do it in a phased kind of way.
To whom would the reins of power essentially be handed to, Abdi? I mean, looking at pinpointing, do you have those who believe in state legitimacy, nationalism, like you talk about, that for whom all these things doesn't fly in the face of state sovereignty, for example? Do those attributes exist now for Somalia as you see it? For something, because you've got to start from somewhere. And if these don't exist, where is it supposed to happen? And it's clear that groups like Al-Shabab can reign in the way they do because nobody is holding on to any of these attributes or trying to even have a legitimate government in place. So are there those who are holding these things and saying, okay, given the opportunity, given the time, then we will be able to bring it forward? Does it exist even as we see?
Yeah. I think I don't want to give the impression that everything is hopeless. I think the country has made some progress in terms of peace building and reconciliation, and I think you are beginning to see the green shoots of peace. This is not a country that is hopeless. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all these actors running to basically have a stake and influence in it. This is a country that probably has the potential to become the Singapore of the Horn of Africa in a few years' time, if only it can have stability and peace. So I think it will get there, but before then, I think we have to be prepared for a very messy process. So definitely, we are beginning to see, I think, a new, class of politicians emerge who are consensus builders, who believe in, inclusive processes. We are also beginning to see a decrease in inter-clan animosities and violence, and that I think is positive. We are beginning to see, I think, more women emerge in positions of influence and power. We're not there yet.
Right.
The situation of women in particular is still horrible. But I think anyone who looks at Somalia realistically will see a country that is beginning, I think, to emerge out of conflict, is on its way towards, I think, prosperity.
There's been a lot of talk in Kenya about Kenyan youth joining Al-Shabaab. First statement, there's a question attached to it. How true is it, and do you have any figures in terms of the numbers of young people who would join? Part two of my question is, do you think that if opportunities were made more available to the youth, that what I have stated, or the numbers of young people who, it is said, leave Kenya to join Al-Shabaab, could actually be reduced?
Yes. The exact number of Kenyan or East Africans who have joined Al-Shabaab is not known. But I think there is no doubt. All the analysis I've seen clearly say that a significant chunk of the Al-Shabaab soldiery, this is probably something close to 60%, is now East Africans. And that is quite a significantly high figure. Al-Shabaab's communique and propaganda material is now done in Swahili. A clear indication that, you have a growing number of Swahili-speaking component. We know, for example, that the leader of the Kenyan jihadi group, Ali Iman, who is from Meru County, is a senior member of Al-Shabaab, and he is in south-central Somalia. So there is a growing jihadi youth component from Kenya, but also from Tanzania, from Zanzibar, from Uganda, who are part of Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is no longer a Somali jihadi group. It is an East African jihadi group. And I think that is an important distinction which ought to be made. You have more fighters probably now, Al-Shabaab, who are East Africans than actually even Somali. So that, I think, is the reality. Al-Shabaab is now a transnational jihadi movement. And it's just no longer a very, narrow Somali militant movement.
Is it true that there's also...
These people,
Sorry, go ahead. Finish.
The question has been asked, how do you get these people out of Al-Shabaab? I think we are beginning to see some of them return. And for the last 5 or 6 years, the number of returnees from Al-Shabaab has been growing in number. And what is interesting is that actually most of the returnees from Al-Shabaab are from Western Kenya, and that is quite fascinating. Al-Shabaab has heavily recruited from Western Kenya for a number of years. It is estimated that close to 2,500 have probably returned from Somalia. I think where the problem lies is, what do you do for these boys who are returning? How do you rehabilitate them? How do you de-radicalize them? How do you reintegrate them into society? And I don't think the Kenyan government has done a good job of really integrating these returnees, or even showing, I think, competence in really handling this big jihadi radicalization problem they have in many places in Kenya. So unless, I think, the Kenyan government also responds, and not just by security means. I think one of the problems we have in Kenya is to securitize everything, to send in security forces and to crack down hard. And we know that there has been a lot of human rights violations. This is not the way to go. You actually create double the problem. Instead of resolving the youth alienation, which gives rise to this jihadi problem, you actually inflame tensions, you antagonize communities, you create hate, and that is not the way to go around it. I think the Kenyan government has to learn that there are better ways of handling these problems, and unfortunately we haven't gotten there yet.
Sure. You recently said, I mean, I'm just going to quote what you said, and you said, referring to Al-Shabaab, it's no longer an insurgency, but an economic power. It's a shadow state that's out taxing the government, even in its areas it doesn't control. And you went on to say that much more entrenched, resilient, and deep-rooted organization that doesn't have to rely on might or military force to stay relevant. This is what you said about Al-Shabaab. Deep-rooted. And if now we're talking about going to the place whereby it doesn't control the state, it doesn't control government, it doesn't control the people, I guess asking you to look into some kind of crystal ball that you have and say, what is necessary to get Al-Shabaab out?
Yeah.
What needs to happen?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think I spend a lot of my time actually looking at what will be the end game for Al-Shabaab? How is Al-Shabaab evolving? What is the best way to basically bring Al-Shabaab out of militancy and jihadism into some kind of a state-building process? Because I think this is a legitimate question to ask, because we see the Taliban now involved in negotiations with the Afghan state. So we can ask a similar question about Al-Shabaab. So I am amenable to the idea of Al-Shabaab and the government having some kind of a settlement, a negotiated settlement. But I don't hold out a lot of prospect for that, largely because I think resolutions of conflicts are usually a delicate balance of power. You know, you have to have two interlocutors whose power balance is the same, or who are hurting from a stalemate. In this case, you have a situation where one side is weak, the other side is stronger and growing stronger. And so there isn't a lot of incentive actually for Al-Shabaab to come on board. They are actually just looking at the country and saying, Amisom is now packing up its bags and leaving, so the clock is on my side. Very soon I'll be able to take over the state. So those are the dynamics which are at play. And so Al-Shabaab will be very reluctant without Amisom actually leaving the country. And if Amisom leaves the country, then they wouldn't need talks. They will just take over. So it is a very complicated, I think, situation. It isn't just simple and saying these parties should talk and there will be resolution. I think negotiations with Al-Shabaab will be protracted. It will take years, probably even decades. So it's not easy, but I see a situation where it makes sense to actually engage Al-Shabaab, and if that can be done by other mediators, other third parties, other foreign states, that has to be, I think, explored. But at the moment, I'm keeping my analysis open on that front. I haven't made up my decision one way or another.
Rashid, Abdi, we want to thank you very much for speaking to us this morning and helping us to understand what's happening in Somalia with regards to Al-Shabaab, with regards to the government and also the other federal states, and what's happening in the country. From this report by the UN, that Al-Shabaab is really gaining a foothold in terms of how it's able to move its cash, generate a lot of money, move it around, and it's trying to infiltrate the formal sector by laundering this cash. Asante sana for clearing all that for us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.